Welcome to the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Every week, you'll hear strategies for building your online service-based business your way. And now, here's your host, veteran freelancer, author, and TEDx speaker, Laura Briggs.
So you know you need a contract with most of your freelance clients, but you get tripped up when the client provides you with their contract, or you're concerned about having to spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars working with a business attorney to create a template you can use now and in the future. Good news. Just listen to this episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast with my amazing guest who has a background as a freelancer and as a practicing attorney. She has templates that are available for you to download and easily customize to your freelance business. But even if you're not yet ready to purchase a template, you're going to learn a lot from her about what to look for in contracts, what things can be negotiated, and what terms in contracts should never be taken out no matter what. Today's guest is Mariam Tsaturyan, a licensed and practicing attorney in the United States who also blogs full-time. She realized that there was a real need for legal guidance for bloggers, freelancers, and entrepreneurs. She enjoys helping out others, especially when it comes to legal matters, because many people ignore just how important it is until it's too late. And she's created several products to help freelancers and entrepreneurs stay legally compliant. You can find information about her store in the show notes for this episode, which will be at betterbizacademy.com/podcast. Mariam goes into a great amount of detail into common mistakes that freelancers make with contracts, ones that you can't afford to make, and some of the other legally required materials you need to have if you're using a website. So that's important. It's often overlooked, right? But you can bundle a lot of those templates in together to get website disclaimers and other relevant policies, in addition to contract templates you can use again and again that are perfect for your freelance business. I hope you love this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. This is probably one of the most requested topics and something that I get the most questions about with the freelancers that I work with one-on-one. It's also a sticking point for new freelancers who are just getting started and either are being provided contracts by their clients or get stuck on this whole idea of I don't have a contract, I'm not making money yet, should I pay an attorney to create one when I don't have any revenue? So my guest today is Mariam, and I am so excited to talk to her because she's got expertise in the freelance world and with contracts. And so we're going to talk a little bit about all what you should know about contracts and how to avoid some of the common pitfalls. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to hear a little bit about how did you get into what you're doing now? You've got this really cool shop that sells templates that makes things easier for online entrepreneurs and freelancers. How did that kind of come about?
By profession, I'm an attorney. So I was just a regular practicing attorney initially. And then some family issues came up. Like I have a son and I had to make a decision to stay home and basically raise him. And we didn't have anybody helping us at that time. So this is how the whole idea of starting the blog, starting the shop was created. And I actually started as a freelancer.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. So what kind of freelance work were you kind of doing when you first got started? Was it legal or something else?
I started off as a freelance writer. And yes, I was doing legal freelance writing for other attorneys. That was my way of making money initially as a way to contribute to the family finances since I was home now and I wasn't working anymore.
And that's so cool because that's 99% of what I write for my clients. And I very rarely come across anyone who has done legal writing for other attorneys. It is not an oversaturated niche, which is kind of good when you're doing it. But it's definitely not something that everybody wants to do. But you obviously have the perfect background to be speaking about contracts. You've worn that hat as a freelancer. You're an attorney. So this is something that just trips a lot of people up. This whole idea of presenting contracts to a client or what to look for when a client gives you a contract that they want you to sign. Why do you think most people get confused over contracts with freelance work?
To be very frank with you, A lot of people, and this is true for any profession, not necessarily freelance writers, but for some reason, when they hear the word contract, whether it's the person hiring you or it's the actual freelance writer, they get spooked. I think they don't understand that the contract is there to protect both sides. When they hear contract, they think it's going to be favoring one side over the other, whereas like a good contract should be a balance of both. Yeah. So I think that's where it's coming from, because they think they're going to be at a disadvantage if there is a contract, instead of looking at it as a positive thing that's going to put everything in writing in clear terms so there's no misunderstanding later on.
And I think one of the other common misconceptions along with that is that most clients, at least in my experience, expect you to negotiate something if it's in the contract and it's questionable. So you don't necessarily have to just sign the document as is. Do you think that there's any harm in asking for adjusting things inside the contract as an entrepreneur or freelancer? It's been my experience that if I see something that's unreasonable, I'll ask to have it taken out. And I don't think I've ever had an occasion where the client didn't take it out. But, I'm kind of curious your perspective on that.
Oh, no, not at all. Contract is all about negotiating and compromise. I mean, there are certain kind of policies and rules that you just have to abide by if they're part of the law, like an official regulation. But as far as the actual terms of the contract, what's expected of you, what you have to do, what you want to do, compensation, deadlines, all of that, these are things that should be negotiated between the parties, because there's no one-size-fits-all approach. That's why, when contracts are created, you can't just have one ready-made contract and then have the client sign, because otherwise everybody would have the same exact agreement. Like, there's always room for negotiation, and you should definitely, if something is unreasonable or if it doesn't seem fair, always raise that issue with the client, or the client can raise that issue with you if it's in your agreement.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of people just get, they feel like the contract's been presented. This is what I have to sign. These are what the terms are. But if you're working with a company as a freelancer, their legal team or their attorney for their business has probably drafted that contract for them. And of course, it's going to favor them as much as possible. But that doesn't mean those are the terms you have to agree to. And I really encourage freelancers to read between the lines on any contracts that are presented to them by clients, because there's a lot of things that could show up that you're agreeing to that you don't necessarily realize you're agreeing to at that point in time.
Definitely. And if you pay attention, generally any proper contract, any like real agreement does have a clause in there that says, this is the final agreement and it can only be changed or added to by the agreement of both parties. So the option is always there. If something's bothering you, if something's not sitting right with you, you can always raise the issue with the employer or the person who hired you. But of course, it's always a better idea to read everything very clearly and carefully before signing it, because it's a lot easier to change things before you sign them rather than after the fact.
Yes, that's totally true. And you're also fine to ask if there's something where you're not sure exactly what it means. When I signed my contract with my literary agent when we first started working together, there was one line in there that just the way the language was presented to me made it sound as though I was signing away for my life, that any book I ever sold had to be sold through her. And I was like, is that what that's saying? And she's like, no, but let's change the language so that you're totally comfortable that we're only working together for this one book. So don't be afraid to, either if you're working with a big company and you want to hire your own business attorney. When I do major contracts, or like when I did my contract with the publishing house, I paid an attorney to look over that and make edit requests and, come up with some things that could potentially be negotiated, because sometimes we're in over our head, especially if you're with a big company that's, a Fortune 500 or something, and you're coming on as a freelancer. They might have a pretty extensive contract, and you want to make sure that you fully understand everything that you're signing.
Definitely.
So, yeah. So on that note, what are the key elements of a contract that are most important for freelance projects? I have a feeling it's probably deadlines, pay, revisions, ownership of copyright. What are the other things that freelancers should be aware of when either creating their own contract to give to clients or signing a client's contract?
Okay. So one of the key sections of a freelancer agreement contract that I always urge my clients to pay attention to is the services provided and the services not provided or not included in the agreement. Specifically, this last section, the services not included, can get overlooked because a lot of people don't cover them. They just put down what services are going to be provided. And that's that. They forget to kind of go over the services that are not going to be provided. And one thing that I have noticed is when you talk about services provided, many people tend to put down freelance writing or writing, article on blah, blah topic for client. And that's that. They put it very generally, like there are no details. No bullet point details as to what that article entails. For example, how many words is it? On what topic is it? Does it require you to do some social media work, any promotional work? Do you have to do any revisions on it? How many revisions do you have to do? All these details that are important needs to be stated explicitly in the services provided section. And then, at least to me, I think what's more important is services not provided or not included in the agreement, because when you don't mention something specifically, a client can keep asking you to do it even though you didn't agree to it beforehand. And especially if you're a beginner freelancer and you haven't kind of established yourself in the market yet, you don't have that reputation, you might be willing to go along with anything at that point. But when you clearly state what's not going to be included in the agreement, then you're very much limiting your services and you're putting a price that if you want this is an additional negotiation or an additional pay that we need to agree on beforehand. Obviously, a deadline is very important, and deadlines needs to be very detailed also. So you need to take into account the deadline for finishing the project and then the deadline for delivering the work. So if there are any revisions in place, what's the absolute last date that the client needs to have this work with them so everything can be ready for publication. You have to have in mind your own deadlines, and you have to have in mind the client's deadlines, and make sure that you're leaving enough wiggle room in there not to get into trouble. This is one of those points that you need to negotiate with the client or the person who's hiring you very carefully, because you don't want to go back to this client later and ask them for more time because you didn't prepare in advance, or the client comes back to you and says suddenly, oh, now you don't have 1 week, you only have 2 days. You want to make sure everything's there so that you're covered.
Those are great points. And I feel like the contract is your final chance to make sure that you and the client are on the same page, because this becomes your written document that you can refer back to when clients try to do things like expand the scope of the project beyond the terms that you agreed to. It becomes sort of it's way beyond the verbal agreement when you can go back and say hey, if you go on and check out page 2 of the contract we signed, we clarified that these blog pieces were 1,000 words each. So an additional rate of blah, 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 per 100 words will apply because you want me to make edits and make them 1,500. Clients sometimes forget too, especially if they're new to working with freelancers or if they've never worked with freelancers. So it's when you send over your contract, and it's what I'm taking away from what you said is to be as specific as possible. When you send that over, that's their final chance to review it and say, yes, we're on the same page about all the details in this project. And if we're not, then let's rework through the rates and come up with a new version. It becomes a lot harder for a client to argue that, they were under the impression that you were going to provide something that you never were when you had that in writing. I love having things in writing because it kind of takes the pressure off of you and saying, well, hey, we talked on the phone that I was going to spend 3 hours on this project, not one. And if you have something like that in writing, it's a lot easier to just say, oh, per our conversation, per our contract, it gives you more of a ground to sort of negotiate from. Yeah. And kind of call them out too, because some clients, whether intentionally or not, they will take advantage of the fact that you didn't get specific enough and say, well,
oh, yes.
Yeah, the contract says
they want a mile.
Yeah, they're like, well, you said you would do blog writing. And so I was thinking that was, 16 blogs a month with unlimited revisions. And it's like, well, our contract doesn't really say anything beyond that. So now it kind of like weakens the whole relationship, because from there, the client is upset, you're upset. It's very hard to repair that relationship. It's so much easier to just start off on the right foot and say, these are the terms. We both agree to it. Another one that comes up a lot is this idea of an escape clause or a kill fee. This usually applies to bigger projects, like, say, a website designer is building an entire website, or a writer is working on a book or a really big piece. And I guess the whole idea behind it is, if the client decides not to do the project for any reason, the freelancer is owed a certain amount of money, usually a flat fee or a percentage. What do you think about these kind of kill fees or escape clauses that allow clients to get out of contracts, and what should freelancers know about those? So
the way I look at that, to me, that kind of falls under the right to terminate, right? A client, the person who hires you, they always have the right to terminate the project. However, if you've done any work for that project, doesn't matter whether you completed the work or not, then you have to get compensated. I think freelancers in general have to get in that right mindset that they're a business owner, and any service that they provide should be compensated. You don't expect any like brick and mortar business to provide you any free services. That never happens. So you have to protect your rights. So you have to come to an agreement in advance when it comes to that. If a client decides not to, go ahead with the project, or if they decide to terminate it before you're finished with the project, then as you said, you either have to have like a flat fee, sort of like a deposit that the client gives you in advance for the work. And this is up to you how you want to negotiate it with the client, how you decide to word your contracts, how you work. Some people decide to work on flat fees, before the project starts, based on a percentage or something. They'll be like, okay, you have to give me, like, let's say $200 deposit for this project. And if the project is terminated, I get to keep that. It's non-refundable amount. And if it's not terminated, then it counts towards the total, or you can work with a percentage, like I required this amount in advance, or even as you're working, if you've done, let's say, if you can put if you can itemize basically the amount of work that you've done, like figure out the percentage of work that you've done and you need to be compensated, then you put that down. For example, like, okay, you've terminated this project, but at this point I have completed 65% of this project, and 65% of this amount that we've agreed on, you need to compensate me for. The specifics, like, as I said, will be up to the individual freelancer as to how they decide to work, but there absolutely needs to be some kind of clause in their contracts protecting them against such outcomes.
Right. And I think for some of you listening who might not have ever seen something like that in a contract, you might be wondering, well, why would we have a clause in there about canceling the contract? Because my intention is to work with this client, from the beginning of it until the completion. And, that's what I quoted for. That's what I expected. So what you're doing with these kinds of clauses is protecting yourself in the event that there are circumstances outside your control, or possibly even the client's control, where you've done work on the project, but they are deciding to pull the plug on finishing that project for whatever reason. It means that you are not left out in the cold. I've also seen this used when people start working together and then they realize it's not really a fit. It's sort of a fee that the client ends up paying to say, hey, like this isn't going to work out, but we're essentially paying almost like we're canceling the contract early fee type of thing. So of course you don't want to cancel your contracts with your clients, but like you mentioned, this helps to protect you if, say, you spent 10 hours working on something for a client and then they say, oh, well, we're not going to be able to finish this. Our business is closing or something has changed. You can still be compensated for the work you've done. And that's probably a case where it makes a lot of sense to do milestones in the contract too. That's what I like to do with my clients. If it's something big, it's like this amount of money is due at every phase, and I'll break down exactly what those phases are. If it's a book, when the first 2 chapters are turned in, X amount of money is due within 14 days. And that helps you to, if they were to suddenly cancel the project, you will at least get compensated for the work that you did.
Oh, definitely.
Now, another one that comes up a lot that I feel like a lot of freelancers don't put in their contracts, and it ends up costing them pain and administrative time later, is a late fee for when the client has not paid their invoice on time. What do you think about adding late fees in contracts as a freelancer, whether you intend to use them by actually charging the client or as more of a leverage point and saying, hey, your invoice is late and it's been 14 days and for our contract, I'm going to charge you X%.
I'm all for that. My freelancer contract, all of them have late fees in there. And I think that's just good practice to have it because number one, as I already mentioned, it speaks of the fact that you're a business, you're a service provider, and you take things very seriously. Number two, it serves as a deterrent, whether you actually enforce this, whether you charge late fees or not. But in a way, it serves as a deterrent for the hiring party, for the employer to not pay you in time. It's in their best interest to pay you in time because they know that you're going to keep adding late fees. And I've learned this particular clause the hard way. I'm an attorney. I should have known better. But when I started out as a freelance writer, after I became a stay-at-home mom, I did not have this in my agreement. I had a very simple agreement, because I figured we're all attorneys, we're professionals, and there's no reason for me to have a very detailed contract. We respect each other, blah, blah. But that wasn't the case. And this late fee became a huge issue for one of my clients. And essentially, if I charged late fees, I would have been owed over $300 more. But because that wasn't in the agreement, I never got compensated. So now late fee provision is an absolute must in every contract.
Well, yeah. And I found that some clients too, they give you the runaround. Oh, well, it's in accounting. And then you contact accounting and that person's out on vacation for 3 weeks. And it ends up being like 2 months that you're chasing down a check. And especially if it's something like $500, it's a huge waste of your time to have to send multiple emails and send multiple calls. And what I've found with late fees is even when it's a small amount, even if it's $25 or 15% of the total amount due, people don't want to pay extra money. And so when you've exhausted all your other options and you've contacted all the people, I like to send a reminder that is a couple of days after, it was originally due, or if I gave them some amount of grace period to get things sorted out, I'll say, hey, by the way, in about 3 business days, I'm going to have to charge a late fee as per our contract. I'm sure this was just, a misunderstanding and maybe my invoice got lost in, another department, but I just want to give you guys a heads up. And 9 times out of 10, your invoice gets paid because they don't want to pay the extra money.
Definitely. One thing I tend to do with my contracts when it comes to the fee provisions, whether it's the late fee, whether it's the invoicing or the amount that the client needs to pay you for the work done, aside from, at the end of the contract, aside from having the actual signature lines, for these provisions, I put like an initial a small line for initials because I want to make sure that the client read this specific provisions in detail and I want to see their initials in front of it. Yeah. So I don't want them to come back later and be like, oh, like, yeah, I signed the contract, but I didn't actually see this provision that you had in there, or I skipped over it, or I skimmed it. I didn't read it all the way. I don't want to deal with that. So what I do is I have an initials placed in the contract for them to initial specifically for the provisions that have to do with fees. So that way they cannot come to me and say, I didn't read this.
I love that. And I do the same thing with a piece that I add in my contracts, born out of a bad personal experience as well, where I ask my clients to initial that they have read my writing samples and accept that what they will receive will be substantially similar in tone and style. And that's to guard against those clients who go, I just don't like it, and they can't give you any more feedback than that. And it's like, if you hire me as a writer, I'm assuming that you have already reviewed my writing samples and you like my style. Otherwise, you wouldn't hire me. But unfortunately, I had one client where that wasn't the case and they just didn't like my writing style. And so now I have that in there, like, please initial here that you've reviewed the samples that I sent you and that we're not going to be way off base. Obviously, it's going to be, personalized to that client, but you're going to see the same, like you're going to see an Oxford comma, you're going to see like adverbs and other things about how I write. So you can't complain about it after the fact. So I love that. And I love the idea of having them initial and call the attention to it so that a lot of this goes back to protecting yourself. So when somebody says, oh, I didn't read that. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, well, I thought you meant XYZ. The contract is that gold standard to be able to go back to because it's like above any conversation you've had or any misunderstanding to say, well, hey, our contract says that this project was $1,000 and you initialed next to the late fee section, which is 15%. And so now we are 10 business days past it being due per the contract, you have a lot more ground to stand on in that type of position when you have called it out and made them sign it. And again, remember that whatever clauses you put in your contract, the client might try to negotiate those too. So be prepared for that. Usually not like you're not going to have unreasonable clauses in your contract, but if you did, be prepared that the client might bring that up.
Yeah. Speaking of that, when it comes time for negotiation or compromise, there are certain clauses that no matter how much the client wants to negotiate for you to remove it from the agreement, you shouldn't. And a late fee is one of them. For example, you can negotiate on the amount of late fee that you're charging. Let's say you're saying $35 and the client says, let's make this $25. That's reasonable. But if the client says, remove the late fee like provision from the agreement, to me, that's a red flag. I would not do that because that client right off the bat is telling you that they're going to be late. I don't know if you want to deal with that.
That's a really good point. What other clauses would you say are in a contract that they're going to stay in no matter what, even if you negotiate the finer details?
So, intellectual property rights, right? Ownership of intellectual property or copyright, trademark, depending what you do as a freelancer.
Yeah.
Since you are a freelancer, your work is yours. You own the intellectual property, you own the copyright, you own the trademark, and there's only very limited situations where if you do something that it can be considered a work for hire when the employer or the hiring party would own the copyrights to that. But it's very rare. There are like a whole bunch of requirements that you have to satisfy before you can be considered a work for hire freelancer. Therefore, a lot of the time, you own your work. And if the client wants to own the copyright, if the client wants to have exclusive right and be the owner of copyright, be the owner of trademark, then that's an additional term that you have to have in your contract. And you have to make it very clear to the hiring person that, hey, I own this. For example, like they had you write a piece or they had you, design a website or whatever it is that you're doing as a freelancer. You own the copyright to that. You sell them an exclusive license to use, meaning you're not going to sell that same thing to another person, and it won't be ethical either since the client paid you for that. But you own the intellectual property to that work. And if the client wants to own the intellectual property, whether it's copyright or trademark, then you have to make room in your contract for additional compensation. So the client cannot own the IP for the same amount of price that they're paying you to get the work done. Let's say you wrote a $2,000 blog post, or you wrote a book for them, or whatever you did for them, and they paid you, let's say, $2,000, $3,000. There's no way that the client will own the intellectual property to that work for that same amount. So there has to be some form of additional compensation if the client wants to own the intellectual property as well.
That's a really interesting point, because I had not thought about it in that way, that it's not sort of automatic. 99% of what I do is ghostwriting work. And so it's assumed in these, and, we have it listed in the contracts that the copyright goes to the client and the rate includes that. Where I see a lot of people getting tripped up with that is, let's say you do have that clause in there where they're being paid because they're going to own the intellectual copyright. One thing you want to clear up with your clients is whether or not you still have permission to share that as a work sample. I think that comes up a lot with ghostwriters, where companies don't really want to divulge that, they're working with somebody else to write their content, that it's not their CEO or their marketing manager. And you don't want to be directing other potential clients, oh, hey, I wrote so-and-so's website, or, I wrote that book for somebody, if you don't have permission to share that as a work sample. So I've seen some contracts specifically with book ghostwriters as well, where it will say, I can't, your name isn't going to be on the front of the book because, you're the ghostwriter. But if you are in the negotiation phase with another potential ghostwriting client and they're looking for references, that person is willing to receive a phone call and say that they worked with you. Or in some cases, you're allowed to share part of the manuscript, for what you worked on. But that's something you want to clarify for sure.
Definitely. In this particular case, ghostwriting falls under sort of like a different category when it comes to rights and intellectual property and ownership, because ghostwriting, the theory behind it is that the client pays you, and generally, I hope that's the case for you, ghostwriters get paid higher than regular freelancers, because the amount of money that they get for that project kind of includes the ownership of the intellectual property. The whole idea behind it is you write it, but to the outside world, it's as if I wrote this piece, which means they own the rights to it. This is one of those situations where you do have to put your negotiator hat on and try to come to an agreement with the client, because when you do ghostwrite, the client is completely within their rights to not agree to let you share the piece that you worked on, whether it's a book, whether it's an article, or whatever it is. Because it's a ghostwritten project, I've known a lot of them. I'm sorry, do you hear these notifications?
No, I don't. No.
Okay, good.
You're good.
I was hoping that was the case, but it's really loud on my end, so I keep panicking that you'll hear it.
Worries.
But anyways, when you're ghostwriting, you have to be a little more understanding as a freelancer of the client, because they're pretending to the outside world that it's their piece. And if they don't want you to be able to showcase that, that's within their rights. But obviously, there are ways of approaching that. There are maybe like, you can make some concessions. You can say, I'm not going to reveal a name. I'm not going to reveal a company. Like, can I just show like a small section of this work, like without disclosing who it's from, or maybe just a first name, or, just a phone call without a name, or something along those lines. From my experience, some are willing to do that. Some are willing to let you showcase it as a work product or a sample of a piece of your portfolio for later projects. But at the same time, a lot of them aren't willing to do that. And unfortunately, there's not much that can be done for that.
That's a really good point, and important distinctions to consider, all with relation to intellectual property and what you can share and kind of what the differences are with ghostwriting versus other types of freelancing. So I know you have of quite a few templates. I know you have an online store, you've got templates with different contracts. Would you mind walking through some of these different templates that might be applicable to freelancers? Because I know it's not just contracts. A lot of us have websites, and I know you've got some of the important and legally required things that we need to have on our websites and other marketing locations.
Sure. So to begin with, the simplest of things, like if you have a website, you have to have a privacy policy. That's non-negotiable. And with the current laws, your privacy policy must be GDPR compliant. And now your privacy policy has to be CCPA compliant, the California Consumer Privacy Act. Yeah. And, if you have any kind of monetization going on your site, if you have ads or if you have affiliate relationships with different companies or even people, then you want to have a disclaimer. Or if you're a freelance writer, for example, you still want to have a disclaimer because you want to make some kind of disclaimer in there that these are work products, your work products, these are your work samples. You cannot make any guarantees, and especially in a situation if you have testimony on your site. Let's say you're a freelancer who has a portfolio and then you maybe have some testimony by a few satisfied clients who said they loved your work or you were the best writer they hired, all that good stuff. So you want to have some kind of anti-warranty or anti-guarantee clause in there in your disclaimer policy that says, it's not guaranteed that they will get the same absolute results as the other people who gave you testimonies, because each person's satisfaction is dependent on different factors. So this is a very minute detail, but a lot of freelancers fail to have this. A lot of professionals fail to have this kind of disclaimer in there. It's essential because a person can come and say, I read this blah, blah, or this person was saying they took this online course from you, or they read this ebook that you made for them, they followed the steps, and they were able to make, let's say, $5,000 in 3 months. And your course was saying, make $5,000 in a short period of time. Well, it's been 4 months and I still didn't even make $1,000, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not very often, but it's a probable and a possible scenario where somebody could come after you for something like that. So you want to have a disclaimer somewhere in there where you talk about results may vary, you can't make any guarantees, all the different circumstances and situations and yada, 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 So in terms of use, it's not mandatory by law, but it is highly recommended, especially if you have any kind of product that you're offering. A service would be considered a product. It's a service, but it's still a product. If you have actual things that you're selling, digital items, ebook, templates, printables, designs, anything like that, you want to have terms of use where you state your intellectual property rights, where you specifically state how others will use your services, and more importantly, how they're not allowed to use your services. So those three policies are kind of a staple bundle policy that every website owner should have. Obviously, they're going to differ. You're going to customize it based on your needs, but those three things you should have on your site. As a freelancer, obviously there's a freelancer legal agreement, the writer agreement, designer agreement, depending what you do. This is the more official contract that we kind of talked about throughout this interview, the different clauses that are included, sections and all of that. There's also something called letter of agreement for freelancers, right? This is a lot simpler. This is a lot less official looking, formal looking. It literally looks like a letter. And the idea behind it is the people or the clients who are spooked by the idea of signing a formal contract, this is for them because it still lays out the important terms that you're supposed to have or pay attention to, but it's not in as much detail. I wouldn't recommend a letter of agreement with somebody that you've never worked with before, or, if it's somebody who doesn't have a very good reputation or you don't know anything about, I would always try to get them to sign an actual contract, full-on contract instead of this. But if this is your last resort, the letter of agreement is a good way to go if the client doesn't want to sign anything.
Yeah, that's all really important. And I feel like thinking about some of these other policies that you might want to have, even if you're at the beginning of your freelance career, is important, because there's a good chance that at some point in the future, you're going to include testimonials on your site. I'm even thinking about, when you expand into other things like books and courses and you're selling other things, you almost always, it's something I recommend to my freelancers, get that social proof as soon as you can. But the flip side of that is protect yourself from people who would attempt to use that social proof against you. And so just knowing that you've got all the necessary policies out there, that you've got a solid contract template is super important. So I will be putting the link to your store and all of the information about that in the show notes to this episode. And on that note, where can everyone go to learn a little bit more about you and what you do?
Well, my website is freelanceandmarketing.com. It's a horrible name, but when I started out, I didn't put too much thought on the name of the website. So that's what I came up with, freelanceandmarketing.com. And once you're there, if you're looking for contracts, you'll see a tab that says legal shop. I provide legal audits to people who want to make sure that their websites are properly set up, or if they're being compliant with a certain policy, or if they just want me to audit their contracts. There's an about section where you can learn a little bit about me. And one thing I wanted to mention, Laura, is I'm putting together an entire bundle for different categories of people, like entrepreneurs. So it's not ready yet. I'm working on it, but I'm working on an entire bundle for freelancers, all the different policies that not necessarily a beginner freelancer, because a beginner freelancer pretty much just needs the legal agreement to start with. Yeah. But as you progress, you might want to hire somebody to help you, let's say, with the graphic creation, or to help you with the research phase, because you're a business owner and you yourself might hire people out for different projects that you get. So the freelancer bundle is going to have a whole bunch of different agreements, policies, and helpful videos and all of that in there for you to begin with. Basically, a bundle that you can get to start your freelancer business the right way. And it's coming up. It's not there yet, but hopefully by the time this episode is published, it will be available.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, keep me posted, and we will add that in the show notes. And having looked at your store, you have a great variety of things to help freelancers get started. And I know some of you are listening and going, she's an attorney. That means I'm paying hundreds of dollars. I'd have to contact a business attorney and they're going to charge me $200 or $300 an hour. Your contracts and templates and policies are very, very reasonably priced. So this is perfect for the beginner, the intermediate, the advanced freelancer. So I know that is definitely a hot ticket item that I am happy to refer people to, because it is, I get that question all the time. Oh, can you send me one of your contracts? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to send you my contract. So it'll be great to finally have a resource to direct people to. But I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show and providing all of this amazing expertise.